Welcome to Good Business Pays Television. We are today joined by someone who knows probably more than most about the whole payments agenda, by Philip King, who is one of our non-executive directors at Good Business Pays, but also has a huge background, a wealth of experience in the payment sector. Welcome to you, Philip, today.
Thank you, Terry. Good to be here.
I'm going to start with the first question, which is, you've been in this business quite a long time, you know a lot about it. How did you get into this whole payments area? Tell us about your story, if you will, please.
Okay, so the potted version of my career is that I started. Well, let me go back a stage. I went for a job as a van driver because I was driving laundry vans and then minicabs. And asked a friend if he'd got a job in his company for a van driver, and he hadn't, but he said you should work in the credit department instead. That'd be really good for you. I had no idea what it was. I went for an interview. To cut a long story short, I was the only person to apply for the job and therefore got it a fortnight later, and joined that company in 1979, and have worked in credit ever since. So cut my teeth there, electrical wholesaler for 10 years, then spent 6 years working for Olivetti in frontline credit management, and then Vodafone for 10 years before I left. And in 2005, became chief executive of the Chartered Institute of Credit Management, a post I held for 14 years. I was thinking at that stage about semi-retiring when the incumbent small business commissioner moved on, and I was asked by Kelly Tolhurst, who was then small business minister, if I'd step in 6 months to just carry the post while they recruited a permanent replacement. 6 months became 18 because of COVID. And then I left the small business commissioner role, handed over to Liz Barclay, who's now the commissioner, and then did indeed enter a period of semi-retirement. And now I work for a few organisations, one of which is Good Business Pays, as you know. Anywhere really, any organisation that feeds my passion for supporting small business and talking about the importance of cash flow and credit management, which in my view are the most important elements of running a business.
So you started seeing this payments, sort of situation in 1979. Here we are in 2023. What's changed over the years? Have things got better, worse? How has it changed?
I think we're still having the same conversations we were having in 1979, sadly. My real involvement came in a period when I was chief executive of the CICM in 2008, 2009, when the credit crunch hit. And Peter Mandelson was calling together all sorts of business bodies and trying to explore what we could do. And one of the things he wanted to do was to help small businesses get cash to survive. He asked me to write a series of cash flow guides, which I did, and are still hosted on the CICM website, to help small businesses. And then he talked to me about setting up some sort of code to get businesses to commit to paying promptly. And when we set that up in 2009, and that's where I really got involved with successive governments talking about the issue of late payment. But throughout my career, as I say, it's been the same conversation. Traditionally, it hangs around the wider large businesses always pay small businesses late, and I think that's not fair, because lots of small businesses pay small businesses late too. It's not all about big and small. It's around culture, and we'll come on to that, I'm sure, a bit later on. But fundamentally, the issue is what it's always been. Businesses don't get paid when they expect, and their cash flow struggles as a result.
And the prompt payment code, which is, I think, probably the code that you're referring to in terms of the introduction of the codes, and the various other things that have been introduced over the years, like the small business commissioner's role. What things do you think have made a difference, given the fact that we're having the same conversations all these years later?
I think all these things have an incremental effect. I've always said there's no silver bullet to this. Inherently, businesses will want to hold on to cash for as long as they can, and won't always consider the consequences of doing that on their supply chain, sadly. The thing I said about the prompt payment code throughout the time that we were running it, after I introduced it for government, was that it didn't fundamentally change things. But one of the key things it did was get the payment onto the agenda. And I appeared frequently on, Radio 4, Radio 5 news, talking about late payment. And those conversations wouldn't have happened if there hadn't been bricks being thrown at the prompt payment code. So it created a conversation that wasn't otherwise taking place. The Small Business Commissioner was introduced as part of that debate and as a way of trying to, shift the dial and make things better. And from the inside looking out, my view is that it has improved. There are lots more businesses willing to stand up and say we behave well and want to behave well and have a good culture. The late payment is becoming more frowned upon, and the work you're doing through Good Business Pays and we're doing is clearly a good example of how that can be used to highlight the issue. So I think the conversations are still there, but I think underlying that, the underlying trends are improving, but nowhere near fast enough. And if you're talking about a day here, a day there, not fundamental change.
So yes, I agree, and so let's talk about culture, because you look at how fast you pay your partner supplier as an issue, just like any other leadership issue. It's a leadership decision. It's probably not a board decision. It's just somebody makes the decision somewhere, and then it ripples through an organization. Is it purely down to people and decisions in terms of how fast these things get done?
It's down to people. Yeah, it's down to the underlying culture of the organization. It's particularly down to the leader of the organization, and it's also down to process, because in most companies, they can invest in the website, they can invest in apps, they can invest in marketing, because those all have a direct return on investment. The money needed to invest in good back office systems is much harder to get, because it seems to show no tangible results. So typically, businesses are using systems that are way out of date or are not fit for purpose to pay, and therefore things go wrong that needn't go wrong. And there's if I submit an invoice to a very large business and I get one little bit of that invoice wrong, it can't be processed. Someone's got to come back to me and tell me that. There's a whole load of things that have to go on. If someone's on holiday for a fortnight and they need to sign the invoice off, it isn't being signed off for a fortnight. So when I've been talking to big businesses, particularly during my time as SBC, an awful lot of chief execs thought they were behaving really well and were shocked when I told them how bad they were. And they said, but that's not how we behave. And it's not how they intended to behave, but the processes were such that it had that effect. And there aren't that many senior managers who are bonused on how fast they pay their suppliers. They're bonus on all sorts of other things. And paying suppliers is just one of those things that happens in the background. But if it stops happening, there's a small supplier not being paid. And I think it's as much inefficiency. There are some businesses that willfully don't pay, and they need to be called out, and we need to call them to account. There are an awful lot who just, don't do what they think they're doing because they're inefficient.
And is it then and I've also found that many CEOs just are not aware if their company is paying more slowly than it should. They're not as close to the action. Where in the organization is that decision mostly made then? By which leader?
I guess it depends on the organization, but it's often in the hands of treasury or accounts payable people. And when I was Small Business Commissioner at the start of COVID, when I was talking every week to chief execs and chief financial officers about how they could help their smaller suppliers in the supply chain, and very often the CFO would say one thing, and you could see the CEO raising his eyebrows, thinking, well, that can't be right. We need to look after our suppliers. But the CFO is worried about the cash flow and about the amount of money they've got in the bank and what they're doing with it and so on and so forth. So I think, if we want to change culture, it needs to start at the very top. And there are some really good examples Pete Redfern at Taylor Woodrow, who set a really good example through COVID in that business, making sure that suppliers did get paid on time, that contractors got paid in advance for work they hadn't yet done, so that they were confident to return when COVID was passed and so on. But in all those cases, it's the leader that sets the scene, and says to his leadership team, anything other than prompt payment is not acceptable. And the good ones get reports on it. They get reported, they understand, they look and they see how things are going, and they ask for answers when the targets aren't being met. But I fear they're in the minority.
Yes. And I think it's one of our jobs at Good Business Pays to call out those people who are doing a great job, because it's not something I found that they actually show off about. So we're always happy to show off for them when they do that. There just aren't enough good stories of the so what. Do you have any examples of the so what? And what I mean by that is, quite often people will say, well, yes, you've got to pay faster because it's the right thing to do. But we find it difficult sometimes to find the small businesses that have been paid faster, and then something has happened to that company, positive has happened to that company as a result of being paid either on time or faster. Have you seen examples of that? You probably have over the years, small companies benefiting in a tangible way from that.
Oh, hugely, yeah. I mean, and many, and you're right that most of them are unwilling or reluctant to stand up and shout about it, because they're just naturally reluctant to talk about their large customers and so on, and are always worried about upsetting them and so on. But yeah, I mean, there are businesses that have grown and developed exponentially on the back of confidence in the payment cycle and being treated by a big customer well. And one of the things we often forget to talk about is the benefit to the big business of paying on time. And if I may, I'll share one anecdote with you. And this is a business that you've highlighted in recent weeks. I won't say their name because this story isn't in the public domain. But this particular supplier is a well-known fast food chain. There were some really bad potato farm floods a few years ago. And I met with their chief procurement officer for the UK and Ireland. And he was just chatting to me, and he was saying that there was a real shortage of potatoes. And this business has a philosophy of using the same suppliers over time because they have confidence in them. And he said that he'd rung one of his key farmers and said, how are things? How are you doing? What's the supply chain looking like? We need, X million tons of potatoes in the next 3 months or whatever it was. And the farmer said to him, he said, oh, it's really tough. I've lost half of my crops, can't do anything. But rest assured, your supplies are absolutely guaranteed. And he said, well, that's really good to hear. He said, but why? He said, because I will put your deliveries before anybody else's. He said, well, that's even better to hear, but why? And he said, because you're the only customer that's rung me to see how things are in this current crisis. And that said to me that this business wasn't just about paying on time. It was about really valuing and supporting and caring about its supply chain. And the benefit to that business was that they never had any interruption to their supply chain through a crisis that affected huge numbers of restaurants and food outlets. And I think we forget sometimes that it does bring benefits. And if you go to a much lower level, I've had some work done in the house over the last few years, and I always pay anyone who does work immediately. They send their invoice, regardless of what terms they might say. And the reason I do that is part because they're small businesses and I've got a passion about it. But also, when I ring them up and I've got a problem, they respond to me immediately because they know I'm going to pay them on time and they trust me. Whereas if I'd left them hanging around, make them chase me, I'd be much further down the list. So it cuts both ways.
Great story. I want to talk about companies that ignore totally their reporting responsibilities. Back in 2017, when the regulations came in, I think there should have been about 10,000 companies that should be reporting. It's roughly the same number of companies now, according to BEIS, and we have roughly 5,000 companies that are reporting. So around half of the companies that should be reporting just don't bother. And so my worry is the tip of the iceberg is that what we see in terms of payment terms is the good and the bad above the water, but there's a whole lot we don't see. What's your view on this, and what do you think should be done about it?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that it probably isn't 10,000, because lots of those businesses will be non-trading businesses. They'll be holding companies and that sort of stuff. There's a lump of companies that, although they technically fit within the criteria, they're not trading, so they haven't got anything to report. But you're right, there are a significant number who aren't reporting, and a significant number who have reported and then have stopped reporting, which is even more of an indication that they should be. And I don't want to sort of castigate government, but they brought this legislation in for good reason, and it's powerful. The data, Good Business Pays is using the data all the time to really good effect. Government isn't doing two things. One, it isn't using the data, so we see nothing from government about what the data says. And I have to say, well, why not? And we see very little enforcement activity. So they don't have the resources to monitor what's going on, or they don't apply the resources to monitor what's going on, and they don't capitalize on the power they have. It's a criminal offence not to report.
Correct. Likewise, we talk about small businesses and small businesses. It's not just about big and small. Do you think there's anything at all that can be done to encourage or discourage, whatever the right phrase is, small businesses from paying other small businesses late? Is there anything that you found beyond just sort of saying you should pay fast?
That's a difficult one, because quite often small businesses aren't paying because they're not being paid. So you could argue that the large business is causing a domino effect on the smaller suppliers of that business. But I think it's around a cultural thing. And I don't know the current stats because I'm not involved in it. But when I was involved in looking after the payment code going back 4 or 5 years, I can tell you that about 65% of the signatories were small businesses. So, although people thought it was a code for large businesses, it wasn't. It was for any size business. And the majority were small businesses who recognized their responsibility to pay their suppliers on time. And I think this is all around the cultural thing. I know many small businesses who absolutely pay their suppliers on time, regardless of who they are, because they know how important it is. Whereas some don't, and that's around preaching the message, getting it out there, getting them to understand, and appreciating that what's an impact for them as a small business is also an impact for other small businesses, and they need to play the same game and play the right way of doing things to make sure they do get paid.
Now, I guess Good Business Pays, we're trying to be, I suppose, a group of change makers trying to change the world for good, if that's not too much of a cheesy phrase. You've decided to join us. Thank you for that. Why did you decide to join Good Business Pays, and what do you hope that we will be able to achieve together as an organization?
Well, as I said just now, I'm dismayed by the way government hasn't used the data, and I'm dismayed by the way government hasn't enforced the requirement under the regulations. And for me, what I see Good Business Pays doing is almost taking the role of government in producing data, analysing it, and putting together best and worst in sectors and in geographies and so on, and in making the data more powerful. The point of introducing it was that when Hancock was introducing this, he said he wanted businesses to be able to go and look at the data and say, do I want to supply that business? And if I do, what can I expect? And the data should have told them that. And the more we can push out the data and the results of the data and the performance being reported by businesses themselves about what they do, and that's what makes it so powerful, the better. And Good Business Pays as an organization is doing that. It's pushing the data out. It's driving the messaging out. And it's making businesses that are meant to report aware that they should be. And it's bringing to their attention that they're not performing well when they're not. I saw some data you published in the last sort of 48 hours and commented on that, because it's interesting that the same names that I was dealing with when I was looking after the payment code 5 to 10 years ago and as SBC 2 or 3 years ago are coming up again now in your data. Leopards don't change their spots unless something fundamentally happens. And we're seeing the same names reoccur. And Good Business Pays is shining a light on this, but it's also shining a light on best practice. And that's one of the most important things we can do, in my view. The more we make businesses look good when they are, the more other businesses will want to follow. And I would hope that non-execs and board members of businesses that aren't performing well will be asking questions at the board table saying, why are we in this position? Why aren't we the same as X, who's doing this so much better? Because reputation is really important in this area. So I joined Good Business Pays because I like what it's doing. I think it can have an impact. I don't think it will change the world, but nor will anything else. But I think it will have a positive impact. And it's a chance to just drive the message out. And I think if we use every avenue open to us, we have more chance of succeeding.
Yes, and you talked about investors and non-executive directors caring. Obviously, we care about the data and we think it tells us something. We just did the sector analysis. We looked at the banking sector. We saw that the slowest paying bank this year was Credit Suisse. It was one of the slowest last year as well. And so to me, again, as a campaigner, I would hope that the non-executive directors, the investors in these companies, see these results and look at those who are paying slowly now with a forward view and think about, should we be asking why we're holding so much cash? Is it because we've sold stuff, or is it because we're holding on to cash that we owe to other people? Do you think that there is something in that for investors and non-executive directors in this data that is a warning light that should be paid attention to?
Absolutely. I've always, in my 40 odd years of working in credit management, talking to credit professionals about this, I've always said to them, you can use credit scoring, you can use credit reference agency reports, you can use all sorts of data, but one of the best forms of data available to you is your own payment record. If someone is paying, if someone is paying you a day later this month than they did last month, and next month they're paying you another 2 days later, something isn't right. Either your invoicing isn't efficient as it should be, or they haven't got the cash that they used to have, or they're deliberately paying you more slowly. Any of those is a warning sign. And I remember, I'm old enough to remember Woolworths going bust, and people at the time saying, if you looked at their track record of payment, it had deteriorated over time, and that was a clear warning sign that they were in trouble. And I know many credit professionals who got their debt with Woolworths down because they could see, what was coming, and they managed their stock down in order to make sure they got less of a bad debt when it happened.
Yes, I think we'll be making more of that conversation this year because we are getting more questions from investors and from people like the NEDON board and Institute of Directors around what the questions should be asked. Now, I can't let you go without asking something that the small businesses that will be watching this will want to know. First question would be around late, slow payment, how not to get into the trap in the first place. And a second question, if you're already in trouble and with slow payment, what do you do about it? And I know you've got some terrific tips.
Okay, so I would say that a small business needs to ask 5 questions. They need to ask why cash flow is important and understand how significant it is for their business. Businesses don't fail because their profits are low or because their sales are low. They're contributing factors, but fundamentally, businesses, small and large, go bust when they run out of cash. So cash is the absolute key requirement for business. So businesses need to understand why that's so important. And I could give you the 15-minute presentation on how they can do that, but I'll spare that for now. The second question is, who are they supplying? Is it a limited company or is it a sole trader? Do some due diligence, know how they look at the payment practice reporting and see how they perform and what their reports say. Get credit reference agency data, understand what their expectations should be, and make sure that the business they're supplying is good for the money they're going to supply it with, so they don't get caught. The third is when. Never supply anything without first agreeing when you're going to be paid for it. I've talked to so many businesses over time, people just said, oh, well, I assumed they'd pay me on 30 days. Why? Why assume 30 days? If the big business is assuming 90 days, you've got a 60-day gap in the middle there of cash flow. So it's really important to understand and agree up front what the terms are. And I remember talking to a guy that used to do PR for me when I was at the CICM. And he said he listened to me preach all this stuff and never really took it into account. But he had a conversation with a big client, and the client said, we want 60 days credit. And the guy said, well, I'd normally just roll over. And I said, okay, I'll give you 60 days, but in return, I want 6 months notice in the contract. So that if you walk away, I've got 6 months to find a replacement client. And the client said, yeah, happy with that. And he said, I came away thinking I was absolutely brilliant. He said, I'd won something rather than just giving something away. And that negotiation phase is really important. If you can find a way of getting something back, if you have to give 60 days, at least make sure it is 60 days guaranteed and you're going to get it on the 60th day. But if, I don't believe 60 days should be the norm, but if it is, get something back, but negotiate, talk about it, and make sure you know what you're getting into. Never leave it to chance, and make sure you confirm it in writing. If you don't do that, you've really got you open yourself up to the position where you're just hanging around waiting, hoping someone's going to pay you, and that's just crazy. You wouldn't walk into somewhere and not ask when you were going to have to deliver it. So why not ask when they're going to pay for it? Those are two parts of the same equation. So always agree the terms up front. The fourth question is how. How am I going to be paid? What do you need on the invoices? Do you need an order number? Must it be sent to Glasgow? Must it be on pink paper with red dots? Whatever the requirements are, make sure you know them. Because all too often, the big business can't process the invoice because there's something missing. The last digit of the order number is missing, or there's a slash missing halfway through the order number, and it doesn't get processed. So make sure you know what they require in order to process. Know when their payment runs are. If they do 2 payment runs a month and they're on Fridays, make sure you always invoice on a Tuesday so they've got time to get it through for the Friday. Just find out what's on the other side. Don't just stick the invoice in and hope. And the final question is where? Where's my money? So when you've invoiced, do a follow-up. Just check the invoice has been received and it's okay. It's customer service. It's not chasing. It's just, did you get the invoice? Are there any problems with it? Can you confirm it's in the system? And if it's a sizable amount of money, that's really good. Otherwise, you find out the day it's due, there's something wrong with it. And then you put it right, and then they wait another 30 days before they pay. So do that. And when you don't get paid, don't sit back and think, well, maybe it'll come tomorrow. I'll just wait and see, because it probably won't. And even in my, I've got, I'm doing the 2 or 3 consultancies, and one of those, I rang up the other month and said, where's my money? And they said, where's the invoice? And I said, I sent it the usual way. We can't find it. Well, find that out in advance and make sure you fix it, but never just sit there once the due date's passed and hope. Get on the phone, talk to them, chase them. And if they're not responding, then escalate as soon as you can. Whether you go to a lawyer or debt collection agency or whatever you do something that escalates it. And I should mention, because I used to be the body, escalate, use a small business commissioner. That's what they're there for. If you've got an invoice owing from a large business and it isn't paid, they've got a team who can get onto the case and talk to them. And inevitably, a call from the small business commissioner has a much more clout than from XYZ web designers. So you're likely to have an impact. But never bury your head in the sand and just wait. That's the worst thing you can do. I could talk about this for hours, but that's the potted version.
Well, that's terrific advice. Thank you, Philip. Is there anything else, we're coming to the end now, is there anything else that you think we've missed off this conversation about payments that you think is important for large or small businesses or government to know? Any final message that you'd like to give before we close?
I think the only thing I'd like to add is the impact of late payment that sometimes gets overlooked. So when I was small business commissioner, in the early days of COVID, I did regular calls with a large number of large businesses who were delaying payments to their suppliers. I countless conversations where I said to the CFO of a FTSE 100 company, do you realize the impact of not paying this supplier their 500 quid on a Friday afternoon. And you could see the lights go on. For them, it was a row on a spreadsheet. We'll cut off on row 33, but if row 34 is that small business, they're going to have to wait another week. And there were a lot of large businesses that did agree to help me help small businesses by reprioritizing and looking at some of those really small ones and just pushing them through. 500 quid to a 250 billion pound turnover business is nothing. So just get it through the system. And there were a number of businesses who just put away all the validation checks for small invoices below 1,000 quid. It meant nothing to them, but to the small business, it meant putting cornflakes on the table tomorrow morning. Because often for a small business, the business is inextricably linked with the household finances. So it's not as simple as the business not being paid. And I think we forget the mental health impact of late payment. If you're a small business, and you're waiting for a payment, you've got to pay your 2 employees on Friday afternoon, or you've got to pay a key supplier, or you've got to pay the rent. The stress of not getting that payment in when you expect it is just horrendous. And I've talked to many small business owners who haven't been able to sleep, who've gone through relationship difficulties, eating disorders as a result of waiting for payments to arrive. And we need big businesses to understand the impact they have. This is not about spreadsheets. This is around life and reality. And as we see the number of insolvencies starting to rise in the coming months, and inevitably they will, then this is going to be even more important. And we need to help small businesses survive and flourish, and in turn that will help big businesses because those small businesses are providing vital services to them, and in turn will help the economy to flourish and survive. And we all need that. This is not as simple as X paying Y. This is around the whole infrastructure of the economy.
Yes, good point. And I think that many CEOs will just not be aware of that stress, the strains that you've talked about. And part of, I think, what we need to do is get the conversation away from the boardroom table and onto the kitchen table almost. And that's where true change actually happens. Thank you, Philip, for joining us today, having such a wide-ranging conversation, being so open with us. I look forward to continuing to work with you to make the lives of small business owners much less stressful, much better than they are today. Thank you again.
Thank you, Terry.